Welcome! In this series of short videos, we will look at topics for the PowerBasic Windows Compiler. Today we will look at the use of graphics controls and animation. When you're designing forms that are going to be user-facing, you will occasionally need to add some kind of logo or graphic on the form. Perhaps the logo of the company. There are many ways of adding graphics to forms, but to make it a little more eye-catching, what we're going to do today is add a graphics control and an animated bitmap upon that graphics control. So as you will see on the screen at the moment, we have a very simple form. I've moved these controls slightly further down the form to allow space for our graphics control to sit above it. So let's have a look at the code. If we go into the Forms Designer, and our form will load up. Now we're going to add a graphics control. And we're going to put this above the text controls. And we're going to set the width and the height of the graphics control. We're going to set these in pixels, and we're setting them to 150 by 81. This allows a reasonable amount of space on the form for the graphics control and the image it's going to display, but not taking up too much room in the form. So we'll just set the name of this graphics control, and we're going to set the style. So we're going to set to sunken and notify, so we can see where exactly on the form this control is going to reside. So we'll just save that and go back to the main application. If we run our application now, we will see the graphics control is visible on the screen above the text boxes. So what are we going to fill this graphics control with? Well, I have created 50 images. These are standard PNG files and were created in Blender. It's not a particularly fancy graphic, it's fairly subtle, but it's enough to show some movement on the screen. And once we have this in place, you'll see the basics of doing all sorts of animation on your forms. What needs to be done now in our application is we need to load each of these graphics into the application. So to illustrate this first, we're going to load a single graphic, the very first one, logo 0001. In order to do this easily, we're going to create and add a new library. And we're going to save this library into the same folder as our code. And we will include this right at the beginning of our application. So in order to load these PNG files, or indeed JPEG files, we're going to create a few constructs within this library. We're going to be using GDI+, which we'll be calling using bits of the Windows API. First, we will create a couple of types. And next we will declare a number of API calls to the GDI+ libraries. So if we have a look at the callback function of our form, this is where we're going to populate this graphics control. As I said, we're initially going to be populating just the one image, the very first one of our 50 images. And we're going to create a new function in a library to perform that function. And we'll call this function load file to graphics control. We're giving it three parameters: the path to where the images are in a subfolder called images, and the image we're going to load is the logo 001, and the next parameter is the handle of the dialog, and the final parameter is the handle of the graphics control itself. So we will now create the new function load file to graphics control. As these are going to be in a library, you can make use of these in other applications. So here is a skeleton of our new function with the three parameters: the path and name of the image, the handle to the dialog, and the handle to the graphics control. Graphics controls tend to work with bitmaps, so we need a handle for our bitmap. And we will also create a couple of other variables for the width and height of these images. The first thing to do within this function is to test to see if the file name and path we have been passed actually exists. So we can use the isFile function within PowerBasic to test for that. If the isFile function returns false, we are unable to locate the image and we will return false to the calling function. If it returns true, then we can go ahead and attempt to load the image. So I'm going to break the code that's going to load the image into a separate function called loadImageFile. This function takes 4 parameters: the path and name of the image, an output for the width and the height in case you need to use that in rescaling your graphics control, and finally a handle into which our bitmap is actually going to be put. If that function returns true, we can then use the graphics attach command. This will instruct PowerBasic to direct all subsequent graphics commands to the specific bitmap in the graphics control. And then we're using the graphics copy command to copy into our graphics control from the bitmap that the load image file has loaded into. And then we can close off the bitmap itself, and then return true to the calling function. So let's now create the load image file function. This has 1 input parameter and 3 output parameters. The input parameter is the name and the path to the file that we wish to load. The output parameters are the width and height of the bitmap we have loaded, and the handle to the bitmap in memory. So we will first set up some local variables to handle the calls to our API functions. And we have a user-defined type here, which is one of the GDI plus types. We can again test to ensure the file definitely exists before we continue. Then we need to do some preparatory work to start up and initialize GDI plus. Next, I'm going to be calling one of the GDI plus functions to load the image from the file specified. Then calling another function, we can determine the width and height. Now we're going to use a new graphics bitmap command. This will allow us to load the bitmap into the graphics control. And another graphics attach command. Next, we are creating the graphic object associated with the handle we have just set up. And the final command is to draw the image to our memory bitmap. And once we've completed that, we can now do the cleanup of GDI+, closing down and disposing of the image and the area of memory we've used to load these bitmaps. And finally, we can shut down GDI+, and return true to the calling function. So now that we have all that in place, we'll actually load our graphic onto the screen. Let's try running it. And there is our graphic appearing on the top of the screen in the graphics control. Now this is just the very first image in a series of 50. So what we've done already is to load the first image. We need to load the other 49, store them, and display them periodically. So there are 2 things we need to do here. We need to load each of these graphics into an array inside the memory of your PowerBasic application. Secondly, we want to put a timer on the form that will display each of these images one after the other. We don't have to show them at a very high rate. Displaying 10 images every second is quite adequate. So 10 frames a second will display on our form. So let's create a new function to load these 50 bitmaps into an array. So for the moment we will comment out but leave into the code the load file to graphics control, as we're going to create a new function. However, this new function is still going to call the underlying functions in our library. We will need to prepare our graphics array. This is the array that's going to hold all of these 50 images. So we will declare this at the top of our code as a global. And the name of our array is strgraphics. And we're also setting up a constant for the timer we're going to be using that will drive the animation on screen. So if we go back to the callback function, the event handler, and we will first redimension the array for our 50 elements. These are the 50 images we're going to be showing one after the other. And I'm going to create a new function in a moment called load file to graphic array. It will take in a number of parameters. Firstly, the path and part of the name of the file. All our images start with logo, then an underline. The next parameter is the number of images that we wish to load, in this case 50. Then we have the handle of the dialog, the handle of the graphics control, and the name of the array into which we're going to put all these graphics. We'll create the load file to graphic array function in a moment. But on the assumption that that function has been completed, what would we do next? Well, we would want to actually set up the first frame so that it displayed onto the screen in the graphics control. So we will use the graphics attach command to tell PowerBasic to direct all graphics commands to that one graphics control. We next need to designate frame number 1 as the frame which is held in our global array which we want to display on that graphics control. We can display these using graphics set bits. It will display the string held within our string array, and that will display it on the graphics control, and we can now use a graphics redraw command to display this to the user. So let's go now and create that load file to graphics array function that will populate this global array. So we will save this and go back into our library. So here is the skeleton of our new function, taking in the path and name of the file, the number of files to load, the handles for the dialog and the graphics control, and finally the reference to the array which is going to be populated with all our graphics. As we know there are going to be 50 of these images to load, we'll need a small variable to count through a for next loop. And as the file name is determined by the element of the array, we'll need to actually work out what the file name actually is. So here is our for next loop, going from 1 to the value of long files, which was one of the parameters coming into the function. And as we know, that's going to be 50. And the file name is formed of the number we're doing. For example, the first image would be image number 1. We're turning that into a string, adding on 4 zeros to the front, and then using the right dollar command to pick the rightmost 4 characters. Then we can test to see whether the path and file name together actually exist as a file. Again, using the isFile function. If that returns false, then we quit straight away because we cannot find the image. Now that we've located a valid image, we can use the existing function to load the file to the graphics control. So if this function returns true, then we have successfully loaded the file into the graphics control. Once that's been done, we can use the graphics get bits command to pull the information out of the control and save it into a string. We can then store that string inside our array. And at the end of the function, we can return true. So if we try a quick compile on that now to make sure we haven't missed anything. And that looks fine. So if we try running our application now, it should display exactly as it did before by displaying the very first image. Which it does. So now that we've loaded all 50 images, we now have to complete our timer control. So we can actually display 10 images every second. So we go back to our callback function for the form, the event handler. And we're going to set up a static frame number. Static variables can be used to hold value, so that when you call a function, the next time you call the function, it will remember the value in that variable from the last call. So after we've displayed the very first frame, we want to create our timer event. And our timer event, using timer1, is set to run every 100 milliseconds. So that'll give us a trigger 10 times every second. We now need a timer event. And here is the timer event. This will test that the trigger is actually for the timer we want. This allows you to have more than one timer on a form. So timer 1 has been triggered. We will then increment the frame number. The frame number will start at number 1. If the frame number is larger than the size of our array, then we've reached the 50 and gone beyond it. Therefore we can then reset the frame number to number 1 and start all over again. And our final task is to take the graphics set bits command to take the string that's held within our array and display it on the graphics control, using the graphics redraw command to let the user see that on screen. So if we try running that now, we will see our graphics control is indeed displaying at the top of the screen. Now while the animation is very subtle, it is definitely there. You don't want to put anything on screen that would distract a user from filling the form in. However, this shows that you can put an animated graphics control on a user's form, and the approach we've used to do it can be used for many different things. Hopefully you'll find this code useful in your applications, but that's it for today. Thank you for watching.